Imagine you live in a small village in the year 900. There are no police, there are no detectives. There is no DNA testing or fingerprint analysis. Your neighbor, a man named Edric, accuses you of stealing his best pig. He is angry. He gathers a few friends and comes to your door. The village elder is called. What happens now? How do you prove you are innocent? You cannot show them security footage. You cannot provide a receipt for a different pig. You have only one thing: your word. And the word of your neighbors. This is the world where compurgation was born. It was a legal procedure used throughout much of medieval Europe, especially in the early Middle Ages. The idea was simple. To clear your name, you had to swear an oath to your own innocence. But you did not do it alone. You had to bring a certain number of other people with you. These people were called compurgators or oath helpers. They would stand beside you and swear an oath as well. But they were not swearing that they saw you somewhere else when the pig was stolen. They were not alibi witnesses. They were not swearing that they knew for a fact you did not do it. They were swearing to something much more fundamental. They were swearing that your oath was clean and trustworthy. They were essentially telling the court, we know this person. We have known them our whole lives. They are an honest person. We believe their oath is true. Compurgation was a system built on reputation. In a small, tight-knit community, your good name was everything. It was your credit score, your social security, and your legal defense all rolled into one. If you were a known liar, a troublemaker, or an outcast, you would have a very hard time finding people willing to swear for you. And if you could not find your oath helpers, you were found guilty. It was as simple as that. The court was not really judging evidence. It was judging you. It was asking your community to vouch for you. This system might sound strange to us today. We want hard facts, we want proof, but in a society without our modern tools, this was a logical solution. Where justice was local. It was handled by people who knew each other. They believed that a person's character, built up over a lifetime of actions in front of their neighbors, was the best evidence you could get. An accusation was not just against an individual, it was a disruption to the community. And the community was the one that had to fix it. So when Edric accuses you of stealing his pig, the first step is not to look for clues. It is to see who believes you. Can you gather the required number of good men from the village to stand with you? The number might be 6 or 12 or even more, depending on the seriousness of the crime and your social status. If you are a nobleman, you might need fewer oath helpers, or you might need helpers who are also nobles. A nobleman's word and his oath was considered more valuable than a peasant's. The law was not equal. It reflected the social hierarchy of the time. If you succeeded, you walked free. Your oath, supported by the oaths of your neighbors, was accepted as proof of your innocence. Edric would have to accept the judgment. The community had spoken through the oath. But if you failed, if you stood there alone, because no one would risk their soul to swear for you, then you were guilty. You would have to pay a fine, return the pig, or face a more severe punishment. In this world, your innocence depended entirely on the trust you had built with the people around you. It was a system of justice, rooted not in evidence, but in honor, reputation, and the power of a sworn oath. So how did compurgation actually work? Step by step. It was a formal process, not just a casual gathering of friends. The law, whether it was Anglo-Saxon law in England or Frankish law on the continent, had specific rules. These rules dictated who could be an oath helper, how many you needed, and exactly what you had to say. Getting any part of it wrong could mean disaster. First, the number of compurgators was crucial. So, it was not a random number. For a minor offense like a small debt or a minor theft, you might only need 2 or 3 helpers. For a more serious crime like stealing a valuable animal or committing an assault, you would likely need 11 helpers to make a total of 12 with yourself. This number 12 was common. It carried a certain weight, perhaps because of its religious significance with the 12 apostles. For the most serious crimes, like murder, the number could be much higher, sometimes as many as 24 or more. The law also cared about who these helpers were. You could not just grab any stranger off the street. They had to be your peers. If you were a free peasant, your oath helpers had to be free peasants. If you were a noble, they had to be nobles. This was called being oath-worthy. Someone who had been convicted of a crime before, or who had a reputation as a liar, was not oath-worthy. Their oath was considered worthless. The court could reject a compurgator if the other party challenged their credibility. The helpers also usually had to be from the local area, people who knew you and your reputation. And often, they had to be related to you in some way, at least from your extended kin group. Family was expected to back you up. Once you had gathered your compurgators, you all went to the court. This might be a local 100 court held outdoors at a landmark, or a lord's court in his hall. The accused person would go first. They would place their hand on a holy object. This was incredibly important. It might be a Bible, a saint's relic, or a cross. This act physically connected the oath to God. The accused would then swear their oath of innocence. The words had to be exact. A typical oath might sound something like this: "By the Lord, I am guiltless, both in deed and in counsel, of the charge of which N accuses me." There was no room for improvisation. You said the words the law required. Then it was the compurgator's turn. One by one, or sometimes all together, they would step forward and also place their hands on the relic. Their oath was different. They would say something like, "By the Lord, the oath is clean and not perjured, which M has sworn." They were not saying M did not do it. They were saying M's oath is true. They were underwriting his credibility. They were staking their own souls on his honesty. The performance of the oath was everything. You had to say the words perfectly. If you stammered, or used the wrong word, or could not finish the sentence, your oath was said to burst. It was considered a sign from God that you were lying. A burst oath meant you were automatically guilty. There were no do-overs. The pressure must have been immense. You are standing in front of your entire community, hand on a sacred relic, with your freedom and reputation on the line, and you cannot make a single slip of the tongue. The value of the oaths also mattered. Society was not equal, and neither were oaths. The system called wergild, or man price, determined a person's worth in society. A nobleman had a high wergild, a peasant had a low one. The total value of the oaths of your compurgators had to meet a certain threshold. A nobleman's oath might be worth 6 times that of a common freeman, so to clear a nobleman of a crime, you might need fewer oath helpers, but they would have to be other nobles. To clear a peasant, you would need more helpers, but they could be other peasants. Spiritual arithmetic, this system reinforced the social structure. It made it much harder for a person of low status to win a case against someone of high status. The whole procedure was a public drama, a ritual that confirmed social order while seeking to resolve a dispute. Why would anyone agree to be an oath helper? Why would you risk your own reputation and potentially your soul for someone else? To understand this, we have to step into the medieval mind. Their world was different from ours. It was a world soaked in faith, where God was not a distant concept, but an active daily presence who intervened in human affairs. And in this world, an oath was one of the most serious things a person could do. An oath was a conditional self-curse. When you swore by the Lord, you were not just saying words. You were inviting God to be the witness and the judge. You were effectively saying, "God, if I am lying, may you strike me down. May you deny me salvation and cast me into hell for eternity." This was not taken lightly. The fear of divine punishment, of eternal damnation, was very real. Perjury was not just a crime against the court, it was a mortal sin against God. This deep-seated fear was the security system that made compurgation work. People believed that few would be foolish enough to lie with their hand on a holy relic, because the stakes were not just earthly punishment, but the fate of their immortal soul. This belief in divine judgment also explains why compurgation existed alongside another, more famous legal procedure, the trial by ordeal. In an ordeal, the accused was subjected to a physical test, like carrying a hot iron, being thrown into water, or retrieving a stone from boiling water. The belief was that God would intervene directly to protect the innocent. If your hand healed quickly after holding the hot iron, you were innocent. If you sank in the water, you were innocent, the pure water accepted you. The ordeal was an explicit appeal for a miracle, a sign from God. Compurgation was a bit different. It was also an appeal to God, but it worked through the community. It trusted that God had already made the truth known through a person's character. A good, God-fearing person would have a good reputation. A wicked person would not. The community's collective judgment, expressed through the oaths of the compurgators, was seen as a reflection of God's judgment. Both the ordeal and compurgation relied on the same core belief that human courts were fallible, but God knew the truth and would reveal it. Beyond the fear of God, there was the powerful force of community honor. In a small village, your identity was tied to your family and your neighbors. Your actions reflected on them, and their actions reflected on you. Refusing to swear for a kinsman who you believed to be honest would be a deep betrayal. It would shame your family and damage the social fabric. Conversely, agreeing to swear for a kinsman was a public declaration of solidarity. It was a way of saying, "This person is one of us, we stand by them." This also worked as a form of social control. Knowing that you might one day need your neighbors to swear for you was a powerful incentive to be a good neighbor. You would think twice about cheating someone or starting feuds if it meant that no one would support you in court. Your good name was a tangible asset built over years of fair dealing and honorable conduct. It was your best defense. Compurgation, then, was not just about finding guilt or innocence in a single case. It was about constantly reinforcing the social bonds and moral codes of the community. It held the community together by making each person accountable to the others. It was a legal system that was inseparable from the social and religious life of the people who used it. It worked because everyone shared the same basic beliefs about God, honor, and the importance of community. For centuries, compurgation was a cornerstone of justice in many parts of Europe. It made sense in a world of small, stable communities where everyone knew each other's business. But the world began to change, and as it did, the system of oath helping started to show its weaknesses. The trust that held it together began to erode. One of the biggest problems was that the system could be abused. A powerful and wealthy man could often find the required number of oath helpers, not because he was honest, but because those helpers depended on him. A great lord could easily pressure his vassals or tenants to swear for him. What peasant would dare refuse his lord and risk eviction or worse? This meant that the rich and powerful could sometimes get away with crimes, while the poor and friendless had little chance of defending themselves, even if they were innocent. The law was supposed to reflect social hierarchy, but this went too far. It became a tool for the powerful to escape justice. Another issue was the growth of towns and cities. Compurgation worked well in a village where you had known the same 50 families your whole life. But in a bustling town like London or Paris, life was more anonymous. People moved around more. You might not know your neighbor well or at all. Merchants and craftsmen dealt with strangers every day. In this new urban environment, how could you judge a person's character? How could you find 12 people who could honestly swear that your oath was clean? The system, which was based on personal knowledge and lifelong reputation, started to break down when society became more mobile and impersonal. At the same time, a new class of people was emerging: professional lawyers and judges. These were men trained in Roman law and church law. They began to think about law in a different way. They were less interested in a person's reputation and more interested in evidence, facts, and rational proof. To these new legal minds, compurgation seemed primitive and unreliable. How could you know if the oath helpers were telling the truth or just covering for their friends? They preferred to hear from witnesses who saw the event, to examine documents, and to use logic to reach a verdict. This new way of thinking was called the inquest or inquisition method, which focused on investigation rather than on oaths. The church also began to have doubts. For a long time, the clergy had supported oaths and ordeals as ways of letting God decide. But in 1215, a major church council, the Fourth Lateran Council, made a historic decision. It forbade priests from participating in trials by ordeal. This was a huge blow to the old system. If the church no longer sanctioned these appeals to God, the courts had to find a new way to determine guilt. This created what historians call a crisis of proof. Courts across Europe scrambled to find alternatives. In England, this crisis led to the rise of something new: the jury. King Henry II had already been promoting the use of groups of local men, called juries, to investigate facts and report them to the king's judges. After 1215, this idea was adapted for criminal trials. Instead of asking a defendant to find oath helpers, the court would gather 12 men from the neighborhood and ask them to decide, based on their own knowledge and any evidence presented, whether the person was guilty. This was the ancestor of our modern trial jury. It was still a community-based system, but the jury's job was different. They were not swearing to the defendant's character, they were judging the facts of the case. This shift from character to facts was a revolutionary change, and it slowly pushed compurgation to the sidelines in criminal cases. Compurgation did not disappear overnight. It hung on for centuries in certain types of cases, especially in civil disputes over debts. But its central role in the justice system was over. The world had become too complex, too anonymous, and too skeptical for a system based purely on who you knew and what they thought of you. The cracks had turned into fractures, and a new model of justice, one based on investigation and evidence, was taking its place. Compurgation was a slow and uneven process. It faded from criminal law first, replaced by jury trials in England and inquisitorial procedures on the continent. But it stubbornly survived in other corners of the legal world. In English common law, a version of it called wadger of law persisted for an astonishingly long time. A person accused of a debt could still, in theory, show up to court with 11 oath helpers and swear the debt away. This legal fossil remained on the books until it was finally abolished in the 19th century. Its long survival shows how deeply embedded the idea of the oath was in the legal culture. But what is the real legacy of compurgation? Does this ancient practice have any connection to our world today? On the surface, our legal system seems to be the exact opposite. We value impartial evidence, forensic science, and cross-examination. We try to remove personal feelings and reputation from the process. We believe that what matters is not who you are, but what you did. A system where you could be found guilty simply because your neighbors disliked you seems fundamentally unjust to us. Yet, faint echoes of the oath remain. Think about the concept of a character witness in a modern trial. When a defense attorney calls a friend, a teacher, or a pastor to the stand, what are they doing? They are asking that person to testify to the defendant's good character. They are essentially saying, this is a good person. They are not the kind of person who would do this crime. This is not direct evidence about the crime itself, but it is meant to persuade the jury. It is a direct appeal to the idea that a person's past reputation can tell us something about their present actions. While the character witness is not swearing a sacred oath for the defendant, the underlying principle is similar to that of the compurgator. They are vouching for the person, not the facts. The jury system itself, which replaced compurgation, also carries a piece of its legacy. The original idea of an English jury was not a group of impartial strangers who knew nothing about the case. It was the opposite. The jury was supposed to be made up of local people, neighbors who knew the defendant and the situation. They were expected to use their personal knowledge of the community to reach a verdict. They were, in a way, the community judging itself. This is a direct descendant of the idea that justice should come from the community. Over time, our idea of a jury has changed to one of impartiality, but the root is still there, a judgment by one's peers. The biggest legacy of the shift away from compurgation is the change in how we think about truth and justice. The medieval world of the oath takers was a personal one. Justice was tied to your social standing, your relationships, and your religious piety. The modern world strives for an impersonal justice. We want the law to be a neutral set of rules that applies equally to everyone, regardless of who they are or who they know. We have created a vast system of police, prosecutors, and courts to investigate facts, a system that tries to operate independently of personal reputation. Looking back at compurgation shows us how much has changed. We no longer believe that God will strike a liar dead in the courtroom. We no longer trust a person's reputation as the ultimate proof of their innocence. But it also reminds us of a time when community was the ultimate source of law and order. It was a system that worked for a specific kind of society, one that was small, stable, and deeply religious. It was a world where your neighbor's trust was the most valuable thing you could own. While we would not want to return to that system, with all its potential for bias and abuse, it stands as a powerful example of how societies create justice from the materials they have. In their case, the materials were not DNA and documents, but faith, honor, and the simple, powerful act of one person standing up for another.